watching this using YouTube or our website. You can do that because you pay an internet provider to have access to the internet. But what if you had to pay to access the websites that you visit most? What if you had to pay extra for higher bandwidth for certain websites like Netflix or Hulu? What if you were starting a new company but couldn't afford to pay for high internet speeds on your website? All of these questions come into play when we examine a concept called net neutrality.
Okay. Before we can talk about why we should pay attention to net neutrality, we first need to discuss what it actually means. Net neutrality is loosely defined as the idea that internet providers should not limit what their consumers have access to. They shouldn't block certain websites, favor others, or erect paywalls in between consumers and services. More broadly, net neutrality is basically internet without prejudice. To gain a better perspective on what this entails, I interviewed Dr. Ben Peters. Dr. Peters is an associate professor of media studies at the University of Tulsa, is an affiliated fellow with the Information Project at Yale Law School, and has authored several books, including his newest one on the Soviet Internet. Dr. Peters has explained the essentials of net neutrality like this.
If you want to go back to one of the very earliest metaphors of the internet, the internet superhighway was a way of thinking about what happens online. That analogy of the highway is actually really good for thinking about network neutrality. Would you, looking at a highway, want to have different costs for different lanes, right? Or should all lanes on the highway be equally open? Not just is there a toll lane, right, where people with high occupancy vehicles can travel, but can you imagine a highway where there was a deliberate slow lane where you could only go 15 miles an hour,
right?
Whereas in another lane you could be going 250 miles an hour, right? If you can imagine that as an ideal form of highway traffic, I don't really believe you.
This analogy makes sense. You shouldn't have to pay to use faster highway lanes, and you shouldn't have to pay to drive at all because you haven't paid a driving tax. It doesn't make sense. However, large internet providers have a more business-oriented argument against net neutrality. They, of course, have a special interest in making profit off the internet. They argue that the internet is not like a highway. It's not the same. The internet is not a necessity like driving is. They argue that paying to watch Netflix is not really equivalent to having to drive on the highway. Driving on the highway is a necessity where watching Netflix is a luxury. From this business perspective, it makes sense that companies would not want internet neutrality. They want to make as much profit as possible. Hey, their bottom line is that they need to make money too. The problem with this argument is that the internet is no longer a luxury. It is a tool that is essential for everyday life. Without it, trying to get a job or get an education is extremely difficult. For example, with net neutrality, people who are looking for a job can do all the regular things that they can do now with net neutrality. They can post their resume, look for jobs, look for education centers. But without it, they would have to pay extra to use certain services. Another problem is that people who need to find basic things like food shelters or supply stores would have to pay a ridiculous amount of money to simply get access to that information. This is why treating the internet like a luxury or privilege is counterproductive. Dr. Peters provided a different way of looking at it.
I actually think that some of the ways that we've talked about the internet and data freedom has actually been counterproductive. And the ways it's been counterproductive is the ways that it's steered us towards thinking about kind of individual services rather than utilities and public service. So actually the idea of a utility like water or electricity or plumbing is a really nice way of thinking about computing. And it was, nobody knows this, but in the early 70s, it was the dominant metaphor for talking about computing. The advantage of thinking about it as a mass service, as a public service, is that it lets us think about what data really is. It's a utility. It's a public utility with kind of infrastructural importance. Not just I'll get it if I can or if I can afford it kind of model, but that your ability to be a functioning human being, never mind productive global citizen in the 21st century, depends on your access to data.
The human access to knowledge via the internet is similar in this way to having access to water or power. Without it, you basically can't live a modern civilized life. So what is the controversy? Why is it so imperative that we understand and adopt net neutrality? Well, simply put, because we might not have it for much longer. In 2014, Verizon sued the FCC, or the Federal Communications Commission, over rules that provided net neutrality. Verizon won. However, the FCC received a staggering amount of public comments, nearly 4 million in fact, asking to reclassify the internet to provide net neutrality. Specifically, these comments called for the internet to be classified under Title II, which means that once you have bought broadband, the provider cannot then take it away or provide any restrictions on that service. This effectively gave us net neutrality. This retitlement of broadband gave the FCC bright line standards in order to pursue net neutrality and prevent companies from committing abuses against the consumer. However, our continued enjoyment of the internet is far from certain. The Trump administration has a different idea about how to treat the internet. Trump appointed Ajit Pai, former lawyer for telecom giant Verizon, as his chair of the FCC. This means he decides policies for the FCC and advises Congress on future legislation. So far, his decisions have not been promising for net neutrality. He has already ordered the removal of several key policies that provide low-cost internet to low-income families, and has also expressed the desire to get rid of net neutrality altogether. Dr. Peters explained why this would be disastrous.
Imagine that you're a new Verizon CEO and you want to make your mark. One way you could propose major profits to the stake shareholders would be to offer a new price schedule that would effectively phase out strong streaming data download and upload speeds to anybody who would pay less than $50,000 a year for data access, and you give the fastest, hottest data access to the elite few who can pay through the nose, and the rest of us are kind of left to pick up the pieces. That would make Verizon huge amounts of money, right? And it would make the shareholders intensely happy.
If telecommunications companies control the internet, they will ultimately exploit the consumer for a profit. They can stifle new businesses by requiring a premium fee for companies to access the internet. They will hurt the ordinary consumer by requiring you to pay an exorbitant amount of money to access the equivalent internet that you have now. Net neutrality benefits everyone, but a non-neutral internet hurts everybody. Small businesses are hurt because they have to pay a premium fee to access websites. Large companies are hurt in the same way, but they will pass those costs on to the consumers, so they'll be fine all in all. The consumer, of course, is hurt by all of this. The only ones that benefit from a non-neutral internet are the ones that control the internet itself.
That a lot of the time in tech discourse, just when people talk about technology in general, we really like to talk about things as neutral. And some of the punch, the appeal of this term is that we can talk about it as being neutral. But on the other hand, I think it may be really important for everyone to understand that even though neutrality, a technical neutrality argument may be uncontroversial, it is actually a really important position, and it is in many ways not neutral. It is a deliberate, conscientious, well-intended, self-reflective position, right? It's one that I actively choose. In some ways, I wish it were I don't want to over-politicize things because I understand how people would push back against that, but
Right.
It's not neutral. Network neutrality is a position for the general welfare of the people, and that's an active political stance. It's not of a particular party, it's not necessarily partisan, but it is an important position. And I do hope that people will recognize how technological neutrality arguments can kind of blunt or blind us to the real humane implications and potential consequences of these tech arguments, and that instead we should be celebrating the ethical impetus behind network neutrality. We need humane neutrality. We need a network humanity.
Network humanity. I like that term.
Right? Or network welfare or something, right? That does good for many people.
Thanks for tuning in to TUTV. I hope that you might have learned something new about the internet and the importance of net neutrality. Remember to check out our YouTube channel and our website at tulsa.show. Until next time, I'm Robert Steer, and thanks for watching.